Get out of the way, old man. This isn't the retirement line. Tyler Briggs's voice rang out, dripping with arrogance, just before his hand shoved hard into the chest of the elderly Martin Hale, 74 years old. Martin lost his balance. His knee struck the hard tile floor. His wooden cane spun all the way toward the door. The newspaper he carried scattered into torn pieces. Too slow getting up. Time for you to go home and turn on the news, Grandpa. The biker's loud laughter echoed through the entire diner. Martin bent down, drawing in a heavy breath. He did not fight back. No one in the diner moved. Only a few phones were lifted to record. "I just want my coffee," Martin murmured. "Coffee? This place belongs to us now." Tyler stepped forward deliberately, blocking his way. Then he shoved again, harder, lower, right into the frail shoulder of an old man. Martin collapsed a second time. He braced one hand against the floor, gritting his teeth, gathering each scattered page of his newspaper. Not a single hand reached out to help him. Linda, the waitress, spoke with a trembling voice. "Tyler, stop. You've gone too far. Shut up, waitress. It's not your turn." Martin forced himself upright with the last of his strength. He said nothing more. He simply walked toward the door in silence. But when his hand touched the cane, his fingers tightened slowly, firmly, with a meaning no one understood. A familiar old pain rose in his knee, and along with it something he had buried for decades, a truth Tyler and everyone in that diner had no idea about. They had just laid hands on the wrong man. If you believe that true courage doesn't live in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, please subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and help us preserve the memory, the dignity, and the honor of our quiet heroes. Silver Ridge was as quiet as an old memory, tucked between endless stretches of pine forest. On the southern edge stood Martin Hale's wooden house, so unassuming that one could easily forget someone lived there. The porch boards had faded with time. The loose fence surrounded a small patch of grass. Dry pine needles covered the narrow walkway. Everything here pointed to one simple truth: he lived alone and had lived that way for a long time. Morning was always the clearest part of Martin's life. He woke early before sunlight touched the hills, put on the same worn brown coat, picked up the wooden cane that had followed him for decades, locked the door with a key whose metal had begun to wear, then stepped onto the dirt road that led straight into town. His steps were steady, carved into muscle memory long ago. Each footfall struck the dry earth with quiet determination. Each breath turned into mist in the cold morning air. His right knee occasionally flared with a sharp pain, a persistent reminder of a past he never shared with anyone. Walking to Maple Diner wasn't a breakfast ritual for him. It was the thing that kept him standing. Maple Diner was a small place with scratched windows, an old sign hanging slightly crooked, and the familiar scent of baked goods drifting onto the street. Regulars came not for excitement, but out of habit. And among all those familiar faces, no one truly understood the old man who walked to the diner every single day. The door always creaked when Martin pushed it open. He never looked around, never sought conversation. He simply went straight to seat number 3, the seat he had occupied for years back against the wall facing the entrance. Linda Perez, the 45-year-old waitress with a tight bun and observant eyes, was the only one who noticed the smallest details about Martin. He always lowered his head when someone passed, always avoided eye contact when receiving his coffee, always held the cup with both hands as if afraid he might drop it, and always said, "Thank you, Linda," in a calm, low, distant voice. Linda once asked Mr. "Hale, is your knee any better today?" Martin replied briefly, "Better, thank you," then sank back into his newspaper as though trying to vanish from everyone's sight. He read very slowly, line by line, from the first page to the last, never skipping even the smallest section, as if there was something hidden in the words he was trying to recover. When he finished, he neatly folded the newspaper and placed it at the exact corner of the table. His tip was always $2, no more, no less. The precision made Linda whisper to herself, he must have served in the military. There was no proof, just an instinct. Leaving the diner, Martin resumed his solitary routine. Back to his wooden house, brewing tea for himself, washing his clothes by hand, quietly tending to memories he never spoke aloud. Martin lived like a gentle shadow in the town. Everyone knew he existed, but no one knew who he truly was. An old man with a wooden cane, a private man, someone who seemed to carry far more than he ever let others see. Some mornings, Linda would glance through the window and see him standing still outside the diner for a few seconds, eyes on his shoes, as if summoning the courage to approach seat number 3 again. Once Linda gathered her courage to ask, "Do you have any family here in Silver Ridge?" Martin paused. A faint layer of old memories flickered in his eyes. He answered with one short sentence, enough to close off every possible follow-up. No one left. And then, as always, he stayed silent until he left the diner. All these things made Martin a part of the town, but the hardest part to grasp. People saw him, yet didn't understand him. They greeted him, yet had no idea what rank his name once carried. They looked at him as a quiet old man, unaware that beneath that calm exterior lay a loneliness that never left, and a past that still burned. This peaceful routine lasted day after day, month after month, until that morning. The morning 5 Harley motorcycles parked right in front of Maple Diner. The morning the bikers' loud laughter shattered the gentle rhythm of the small town. And just as Martin placed his hand on the door handle, the cold slipped through his worn coat, and the invisible life he had lived for decades was about to break apart. That morning was colder than usual. The air in Silver Ridge was sharp enough that every breath Martin Hale exhaled turned into a thin white mist. He kept his steady pace along the familiar road, his wooden cane striking the ground in a worn, melancholy rhythm, steady old, but unbroken. But just as he turned the corner where Maple Diner sat, the roar of Harley engines shattered the silence. 5 large motorcycles crowded the front of the diner. Black leather jackets, heavy boots, loud laughter. Maple Diner, the place where only the soft clink of plates was heard, had been overtaken by a rowdy group of young men. Martin paused for half a second, hesitation flickering in his eyes, but he still pushed the door open. The atmosphere inside was nothing like the usual mornings. The quiet conversations were gone. The scent of morning coffee was drowned by cigarette smoke and noise. And right in front of him, seat number 3, his familiar spot, was already taken. Tyler Briggs turned around, the smirk on his face sharp and mocking. "This town belongs to people like us, not relics like you." His voice cut through the room, turning the air heavy. Martin stopped. He didn't argue. He only wanted to step aside, find another seat. "I just want my coffee." Tyler stepped closer, blocking him like a wall. "Did you hear me, old man?" Linda watched from behind the counter, her hands trembling as she set a cup down. Other regulars shrank back, avoiding eye contact. Some bowed their heads. Others raised their phones to record as if this were nothing more than casual morning entertainment. Martin tried to shift his shoulder to slip past, but Tyler didn't give him a chance. He shoved him hard in the chest. The old man's body couldn't withstand the blow. Martin collapsed onto the tile floor. A sharp, stabbing pain shot through his right knee, as if a blade had twisted inside. His newspaper burst into scattered pages across the feet of indifferent onlookers. Linda cried out, her voice choked with panic. "Tyler, stop, what are you doing?" Tyler turned to her, eyes cold. "Back off, waitress." Martin placed one hand on the floor to push himself up. His movements were slow, stiff, but filled with dignity. He crouched down to gather the scattered pages. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from humiliation buried too deep for too long. No one came to help, no one apologized. Only avoiding eyes and uncomfortable silence. Martin whispered, barely louder than a breath. "Sorry for the trouble." He straightened his back, locking his emotions behind silence. He didn't look at anyone. Didn't say another word. He simply walked out of Maple Diner for the first time in years, without drinking his morning coffee. The door closed behind him, leaving a heavy stillness hanging in the room. Outside, the cold wind slipped through his worn brown coat, but that chill was nothing compared to the feeling of being trampled on a wound, reopened after decades of trying to forget. Martin walked slowly down the road toward the house where he had lived alone for so many years. Each step pressed down a little pain, a little memory, and a part of something he had buried far too deeply. And as his old fingers tightened around the cane, a silent decision began to take shape, as if something ancient within him was awakening. The walk back home felt longer than usual. Every step Martin Hale took carried the weight of what had happened. The humiliation did not anger him, but it awakened a layer of memory buried deep beneath the years. When he stepped onto the old wooden porch of his house, his heart seemed to beat slower, as if preparing itself to reopen a part of the past he never wanted to face again. He hung his coat on the hook, stood still for a few seconds by the back door. Then, with a strange calmness, Martin walked straight into the backyard, where a small wooden shed stood. Its pine boards faded with age. The door was secured with an old iron lock coated in dust. He crouched and picked up the third stone on the left, the place where he had hidden the key for 2 decades. The lock clicked open with a short sound, but to Martin it echoed like the opening of an entire lifetime. Inside the shed was the smell of old wood dampness and the years he had chosen to bury. On an old wooden table lay a blue tarp covering something. Martin stood before it for a few seconds, as though asking the past for permission, before touching it again. Then he gently pulled the tarp down. What appeared beneath it made the small room feel heavy. Maps of Southeast Asia, combat zones, the edges yellowed. Medals stored in faded velvet boxes, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Medal. A Colt 1911 he had carried through the harshest years of his life. And at the center of the table, a black rotary telephone, its cable wired into a special line that never appeared on any bill. Martin pulled a chair forward. He sat down slowly, his hands resting on the table, no longer trembling the way they had when he left the diner. The silence in the shed did not disturb him. It felt like the greeting of an old comrade he had not seen in years. Martin reached for the receiver, each joint moving with decisive precision, as if he had never forgotten the task. He dialed each number. The clicking of the rotary dial sounded soft but steady, a familiar rhythm from days when life and death were separated by a single decision. The call was answered just as the first ring finished. "Control here. Identify." The voice was old but sharp, firm as forged steel. Martin drew in a deep breath. A sentence he had not spoken in 20 years. A title. "He control this?" Is Master Sergeant Hale echo. Silence held on the other end for half a second. Then the old man's voice broke through faintly, trembling with surprise. "Hale." After all these years, Martin closed his eyes and briefly, as if seeing the faces of the men he once led through jungles, through artillery fire, through battles whose true cost only those who lived them could ever understand. "I need the team. Whoever's still operational. Send them all." A long breath came through the line, carrying both astonishment and the sorrow of time passing. "Let me check. Some of them are still around. Not many. But enough." Martin gave a short, clear reply, the kind that once guided men through war as soon as possible. He set the phone down. He didn't rise from his chair. He stared at the medals laid before him, medals he had never shown, never displayed, never mentioned. He kept them not to remember, but to make sure he never had to use them again. But today, he had used them. Outside, the wind threaded through the pine trees. The small shed felt like a pocket of time carved away from the world, a place where the present bowed quietly to the past. Martin stood up, pulled the tarp over everything once more. He locked the door again, hid the key back under the stone, and returned to the house. In the dimming afternoon light, his steps were soft but firm. Some messages from the past once sent bring their answers faster than anyone expects. Less than an hour after that secret phone call, Silver Ridge began witnessing something no one in town could explain. The deep, thunderous rumble of engines echoed from the end of Grant Avenue. 6 armored black SUVs rolled in one by one, stopping in a straight line in front of Maple Diner, the place where just hours earlier an incident had left the entire town murmuring. The doors opened almost simultaneously. No one rushed out. No one looked around, seeking attention. They stepped out one by one, each with a straight posture, sharp eyes, and a presence that made the air on the street feel heavier. The first was Colonel William Briggs, 68, broad-shouldered, his back as straight as if he had never taken a day off from service. He glanced briefly around the street, his gaze settling as if searching for a familiar signal. Next was Sarah Quinn, 61. Her hair cut short, her face marked with the firm lines of someone who had stood in the middle of battlefields as a combat medic. Her hand rested lightly near her waist, the old habit of someone who once carried a medical kit for years. From the third SUV stepped Joe Ramirez, 67, his gaze sharp as a blade, the gaze of an ex-sniper. Time had marked his body, but every step he took still carried the precise rhythm of a man who once measured breaths on the battlefield. Then came Walker, the former communications specialist, Torres, the reconnaissance expert, and Kim, the man with an incredible memory for maps and coordinates. They were not flashy heroes. They were the kind who had stood side by side when life was measured in minutes. And then the last SUV door opened. Martin Hale stepped out. His wooden cane was still in his hand, but his posture was different, no longer quiet, no longer bowed. What remained was the calm of a man who had just put back on a skin he thought he had shed forever. Briggs walked toward Martin, no long speeches needed. He raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Good to see you again, Sarge." Martin returned the salute, slow but precise. "Colonel, thank you for coming." Sarah came up beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm, her eyes carrying the kind of warmth shared only between people who had survived together. "You called. That's all we needed." Joe Ramirez stood next to them, his voice steady and low. "Just tell us who laid a hand on you. We'll take care of the rest." People in Silver Ridge began to gather, eyes fixed on the strange group of veterans who had suddenly appeared in their quiet town. They didn't understand why these men and women looking like something out of America's military history had arrived here. They didn't know what was happening, but they felt instinctively that whatever it was, these people weren't here for something small. Martin turned his eyes toward Maple Diner, where Tyler and the biker group were still laughing loudly inside, unaware of what was coming. Briggs followed Martin's gaze, then gave a slight nod, as if everything was already understood. "Let's go in, Sarge." Martin didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the wooden cane the way he once tightened his grip around a rifle he never forgot. The group walked in a natural formation, without orders, without reminders. They had walked like this before, through jungles under gunfire, where a single misstep could cost the whole team their lives. And today, they walked together again, not for a battlefield, but for something much simpler, the dignity of their old brother in arms. 6 veterans stood aligned in front of Maple Diner. Townsfolk whispered. Some recognized faded patches on their jackets. Others murmured they look like military, the kind you hear about on the news. Some swallowed hard, feeling an inexplicable sense of respect. Briggs placed a firm hand on Martin's shoulder, his voice low and steady. "You never stand alone, Sarge. Not while we're still here." Martin exhaled slowly, not out of exhaustion, but from a relief he had lost long ago. And as Briggs pushed the diner door open with a gentle, deliberate motion, the atmosphere inside was about to change in a way the arrogant never saw coming. When the group of veterans stepped into Maple Diner, the entire atmosphere changed. No one raised their voice. No one acted aggressive. But every step they took cut through the conversations in the room, as if an invisible doorway between past and present had just opened in the middle of this small town. Tyler Briggs saw Martin enter with 6 older, unfamiliar men beside him. He let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Who are these fossils?" His laughter echoed, but no one joined him. "Briggs." Colonel William Briggs stepped forward. He didn't look at Tyler, nor did he show anger. He spoke in a low, steady voice, heavy like old steel. "My name is Colonel William Briggs, U.S. Army retired, and I want you to know exactly who you laid your hands on this morning." Tyler straightened up, the smirk on his face fading. "Him." That old guy Sarah Quinn stepped up beside Briggs. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp like a freshly honed blade. "He carried me 15 kilometers through the rainforest when I was bleeding nonstop and thought I wouldn't survive to see sunrise. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here." Joe Ramirez moved one step forward, his gaze cold and precise. "When our rations ran out, he shared his last portion with the 19-year-old kid in our squad. The boy was shaking with fear, and he starved himself for 2 days. No one told him to do it. He chose to." Walker placed a hand on his chest where a radio once hung. "The night we were surrounded, he stepped out to be the decoy. Alone. He held off an entire company so we could escape. Without him, none of us would have survived." Torres nodded, his voice deep and firm. "None of us ever forgot. And none of us ever imagined we'd see him shoved to the ground in some diner by a kid who doesn't even know what war looks like." The entire diner fell silent. Linda stood behind the counter, one hand over her mouth, her eyes red and wet. Regular customers rose from their seats, turning to look at Martin as if they were seeing a completely different man. Tyler froze as he realized all 6 veterans were staring at him. He swallowed hard sweat forming at his temples. I didn't know." His voice trembled, threatening to break. Colonel Briggs turned toward him, his old eyes unsoftened. "You don't need to know who he is to treat someone with respect. Decent people don't wait for a reason to do what's right." Tyler stepped back half a pace. Martin still stood there, silent. Not proud, not angry, just quiet, the same quiet he had carried through the years. Linda found her voice shaking with guilt. "Mr. Hale, I'm sorry, I didn't think it would go this far." Martin shook his head gently. "You did nothing wrong." Those words made Tyler bow his head even lower. He knew that Martin hadn't spoken to him yet. Somehow the words made him feel smaller than he had ever felt. In that heavy atmosphere, the diner door suddenly swung open. A middle-aged man entered, a face known throughout the town, a man of influence wearing an expression that held both anger and shame. And his arrival was about to drive everything toward the moment no one could avoid. The door of Maple Diner burst open so forcefully that several people flinched. Richard Briggs, Tyler's father, stepped inside with a face flushed red with anger. He was the biggest contractor in town, a man whose presence alone could silence a room. Today, his eyes were fixed on only one person, his son. "Tyler, get over here. Now!" Tyler jolted, his lips trembling, his legs unsteady as he stepped away from his group of friends. "Dad." Richard didn't let him finish. "I just heard what you did. You disgraced this man. You disgraced this entire town. Apologize. Now." The diner seemed to freeze in place. No more laughter. No more noise. Only the quiet breathing of people witnessing a lesson they would never forget. Tyler bowed his head as low as he could, his shoulders shaking like someone standing in the path of a storm. He walked slowly toward Martin Hale, his eyes avoiding everyone's gaze, his hands clenched together to hold back the shame. "Mr. Hale, I'm sorry." His voice was hoarse. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm sorry." Martin looked at him. Not with bitterness, not with blame, just with the gaze of a man who had lived far beyond anger, a man who understood that some wounds didn't need more salt, just the right words. He spoke calmly. "Respect isn't complicated, son. You just didn't want to see it." Tyler lifted his head for half a second, then immediately lowered it again. The words weren't sharp like a knife, but they weighed like stone, heavy enough that he couldn't lift his head anymore. Richard Briggs turned toward Martin, his voice dropping into something thick with remorse. "Mr. Hale, I'm sorry. As his father, the fault is heavier on me. I failed to teach him to respect the men who protected this country." Martin gave a slight nod, refusing to prolong the boy's humiliation. Linda Perez, who had witnessed everything, suddenly let out a soft sob. She placed a hand on her chest, her eyes red with guilt. "Mr. Hale, I'm sorry. I saw everything. I should have done something. I was scared." Martin turned to her, his voice softer than the morning breeze, fears heavy. "I understand." Linda covered her mouth as tears fell, not from shame but from gratitude, as if someone had lifted a heavy burden she'd been blaming herself for all morning. Around the diner, a few elderly patrons clenched their hands. A few others bowed their heads. Everyone sensed they had just witnessed something far bigger than a confrontation. They had seen a town pulled back from the quiet cruelty of indifference. Tyler stood frozen, unsure whether to move or stay. No one was scolding him anymore, and that silence made him feel smaller than any scolding could. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder and squeezed gently, not to comfort him, but as a reminder that from this moment on, Tyler would have to carry the responsibility for what he had done. Maple Diner gradually regained its morning warmth, but the atmosphere had changed. The coldness of apathy was gone. The blank stares at another person's humiliation were gone. In their place was a quiet respect for the old man standing at the center of the room, the man they had thought was invisible until this morning. And as Richard turned toward the people waiting outside, preparing to speak what he knew was right, the change inside the diner was about to ripple through the town in ways no one could have imagined. The silence inside Maple Diner shifted into something else, not heavy, not tense, but like a door opening to let light pour in. Richard Briggs stood at the center of the diner, looking around at the faces watching him. And with a clear voice, he announced something no one in town had ever imagined hearing. "From today on, Mr. Martin Hale has his own reserved seat at Maple Diner, and every meal he has here is free for life." The first sound to break the stillness was a few gasps of surprise, then a round of applause, and then the entire diner joined in a loud, unified clapping that felt like everyone was apologizing for not seeing him sooner. Linda wiped her tears, a trembling smile appearing on her emotional face. Regular customers stepped closer to Martin, saying nothing, simply placing a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture, but enough for him to understand the town had finally seen him. The veterans stood together, shaking hands one by one. No grand speeches, no dramatic words, just the strength of those firm handshakes, a promise that they would never disappear from each other's lives again. They had survived together once, and now they stood together again for a different reason, one far warmer and gentler than war. Martin looked at seat number 3, his seat. That small, ordinary spot had been the only anchor in his lonely life for years. Today, it was no longer the anonymous place of a forgotten old man. It was a mark of respect. He walked over, pulled the chair out, and sat down. For the first time in decades, the hand he placed on the table wasn't trembling. He no longer felt the need to shrink into himself, no longer feared being seen as a shadow. Linda gently placed a hot cup of coffee in front of him. She didn't say a word. Martin looked at her and nodded. In her eyes, he saw a silent vow she would never again stand still while something cruel unfolded in front of her. News spread outside quickly. People gathered in small groups by the diner window, whispering the name they had once said so casually. Who is he really? Did he really save his whole unit in the war? We had a hero living in this town, and we never knew. Those questions weren't filled with doubt. They carried respect and regret that they had let a piece of living history walk past them every day without noticing. Colonel Briggs stepped up beside Martin, bending slightly to speak to him alone. His voice wasn't loud, but each word struck like a nail driven into wood. You were never forgotten, Sarge. Martin looked down at the table, then raised his eyes again, no longer burdened by the sadness he'd carried for so many years. He answered with a short sentence that held a lifetime of silence, just unseen. Not anymore. The words spread through the diner like warm water. An elderly man stood up and placed a hand over his heart. A young man removed his cap and bowed his head. For a few seconds, the entire Maple Diner stood still, not because they had to, but because they knew the moment deserved a silence filled with respect. Martin took his first sip of morning coffee, the warmth sliding down his throat like a reminder. He was no longer alone, no longer walking unseen through the town, no longer suffocating under a past he carried in silence. He had been seen and remembered. It was a gift he had never asked for, but one he deserved more than anyone. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.